you very much for inviting me today. It was a bit of a last-minute request, I think, as well. I'd usually have a couple of colleagues here to share as well. Just wanted to share some information about a campaign that we're going to launch on the 1st of March. We were inspired by Nav, who's with us today, and some of the things he's said over recent years about self-harm in older people. So if we go to the next slide, please. Well, I really hope this works. I'm not going to dwell on some of these slides because it will be, obvious to you, but we've all heard different myths around self-harm. And when I was actually looking up a few other myths, and I know Samaritans have a whole list of them, quite a lot of them I noticed did focus on self-harm in younger people. Next slide, please. So there is the definition from the NICE guidance in regard to self-harm, and with our focus being on older people, I've been working with a consultant clinical psychologist who's the trust clinical lead for older people's psychological therapies. We've also been fortunate enough to have a representative from NKISH on our working group as well, Ali, it's been brilliant. And we've been working with the Greater Manchester Older People's Network as well. So next slide, please. So the NICE guidance, and I know self-harm is under review, but it is stressing that all people 65 and over who self-harm should be assessed by mental health professionals experienced in the assessment of older people who self-harm. And I know from what Nav has said in recent years that those assessments aren't always forthcoming. And next slide, please. Sorry, we're zooming through these slides. So some of the facts and figures, and I'll never forget hearing this when Nav mentioned it must be about 3 years ago now. I heard him say that for older people who self-harm, there are 67 times a greater risk of suicide, which absolutely stunned me, than the general older population, and almost 3 times greater risk of suicide than young people who self-harm. Yet everything I've been hearing about seems to be focused on young people. So I've got a number of statistics in there that we've gathered. And Nav, if anything is now out of date, please tell me. But we know that there's that elevated risk of suicide in older people who self-harm. And only 12% of those over 65s who self-harm are actually referred to mental health services within 12 months of their initial self-harm episode. I was interested to hear Nav when he opened up the meeting saying that there'd been no reduction in mental health referrals for those 65 plus during the COVID times, but I just wondered if that was still, that the referrals are still low in number. It looked good that there hadn't been a reduction, but if they're low in number in the first place, then that's still an issue. So referrals are a third less likely for older people in the most deprived areas, even though the incidence of self-harm is higher in those areas, and 1 in 7 older people self-harm again within a year of the initial episode. So all these facts and figures kind of really made me sit back and think. Next slide, please. I've included this slide because Polly Kaiser, who is the consultant clinical psychologist who's been working with us, it was actually one of her slides when we've been presenting this, and various reasons she talks about, and she gives some examples. I'm sorry I couldn't bring her along today, but she talks about different, possible reasons behind self-harm in older people. Next slide, please. She also shares this slide about the influencing factors in self-harm. I don't know if you can actually see that, but we are talking about the history of self-harm, obviously alcohol and substance misuse, comorbid physical conditions, social isolation, housing issues, financial problems, all these things are listed. Next slide, please. So these were the risk factors for older people for self-harm and suicide pre-COVID. And we look at the situation we find ourselves in now and think, whoa, this is all far more concentrated. So if these were the risk factors before COVID, how much more do we need to take this seriously now with the current situation that we're in? We know older people have really suffered through COVID with the isolation and, you know, a lot of more bereavement. Next slide, please. I'll leave those in. I'm not going to click on them, but when the slides are shared, which will be after the 1st of March when our campaign starts, you might want to take time just to have a look at those. A couple of links that I've come across. I'm sure there's more out there. And the next slide, please. And now I'm going to play your interview, if that's okay, or if I can ask if we can click on that YouTube link. Now, this week I did email just to clarify, because in the earlier slide we talked about 65%, 65 times more likely to die by suicide. But in this clip, I think from 2018, you actually quote 145, I think it is, % higher, if I've remembered, not percent, sorry, 145 times higher chance of suicide. And when I queried it, as I'm not a researcher or a clinician, it was explained to me that these were two different studies. One was focused on A&E presentations, and the other one was on GP presentations. And these were the results of those. I know, Nav, do you want to?
That's absolutely right, Adele. So in fact, you are a researcher, because, you know, that's the thing. If you do your studies in different settings, obviously you get different findings. The really important thing is that the risk of suicide is increased. It's increased markedly, and it's increased markedly even more than for people in general who self-harm. So we know that in general, self-harm is the most important risk factor for suicide. The really important message is it's even higher than that for older people. But actually, you know, where you do your study, how you do your study, how you do your linkage will affect the exact figures. But it's a high risk is the big thing.
So I don't know if we can get the slides back up on screen. I know, and there is that YouTube link if it's possible to play that. If not, I'll move on and you can catch it later.
No, that should be fine.
Oh,
let's
thank
let
you.
it go.
Thank you. I know I haven't got sound. Has anybody else struggling with sound?
No, I haven't got sound either, and it's a very bizarre.
Can you not remember the script now?
I probably can, actually. I probably can. I think from that study, that was a really important study. Maybe I'll just do it live then, Adele. That was a really important study because it was based on primary care. So a lot of our data is from hospital records, and but this was, you know, based on primary care records. So it was a much wider group of people. And for me, there were three really important messages for the study, and it got picked up quite a lot on the media. The first message is that self-harm actually happens in older people, because, you know, as Adele, as you kind of rightly said, sometimes when you talk about self-harm, people just focus on younger adults, and particularly kind of girls. You know, that's sometimes the impression in, you know, people's heads. So the first really important message was that it happens. The second really important message is about the high risk of suicide, which we've talked about before. And I think the third really important message is what you've talked about, which is the risk factors, that older people who self-harm probably have specific needs. And if we want to intervene, if we want to make a difference, things like social isolation and bereavement, things like physical illness, and things actually like, you know, psychiatric illness are probably more important, are probably, you know, more beneficial targets for intervention than in younger groups. So I think those are the three things from that study. And generally, The other thing I think is just about kind of treatment and thinking about aftercare in general. And we talked in that study about, you know, prescriptions, which, you know, and medication does have a role for some people after self-harm, you know, if they've got an underlying condition, but also access to psychological therapies. So I think that's from the study. The other thing I think that, again, you know, you've brought out really nicely is what has the effect of the pandemic been on older adults, particularly from the view of suicidality. So no studies have looked at you know, suicide rates just in older people, but that ONS data did show that in women over 75, rates didn't go down like they did in other groups. In fact, they looked like they went up. The older data from the SARS epidemic in the Far East showed that the one group where rates did increase was, again, older women, and that was felt to be because of a disruption of normal social and helping networks. So there are precedents here, and those risk factors you put up, the effects of COVID, I think, you know, it's very, you know, it's very important that we don't forget about this this really important group. So there you go. There's the live version.
Thank you very much, Nav. Thank you. So just going back to my slides, if that's okay. So something that Polly often says when we're talking about some of those, I don't know, can we go back one? Let me just remind myself where we're up to. Ah, great, that's fine, thank you. You know, all these issues that I listed before and we talked about, they're not inevitable parts of aging. It's not, you know, something that's inevitable. So we can kind of try and influence them. So yes, sorry, next slide. So in Greater Manchester, we have our Shining a Light on Suicide campaign, which started, was launched in 2019. So building on that programme, we made self-harm in older people a priority that our programme board did last year. And we've been working with the Greater Manchester Older People's Network to co-produce this an awareness campaign. I mentioned that we've had Ali Bird from Enkish, who's very kindly been joining our working group. We've been linked in with our GM aging groups as well. And we've also had one of our IAP leads, and Chris, who has joined us at meetings, he shared that for those older people that do access talking therapies, actually they're more likely to complete the sessions and have a higher success rate. So it's trying to get that message across as well, that there are things that you can, you know, to offer older people, and there is hope of recovery and some success from that. So it's not an inevitable part of aging if somebody feels anxious or depressed when they're older. So next slide, please. So this is where my colleague from the Older People's Network, she is an older person herself. She actually chairs the Older People's Network Health and Social Care Group. And these are slides that she will be sharing with you now. So it is a group that's led by older people. They are very age proud, and it's representative and inclusive. And they've been working on a number of campaigns to try and change the stereotype image of what it's like to be older. So it's been really valuable working with this group. Next slide, please. So what we did was we've held 2 focus groups with the Greater Manchester Older People's Network at different stages of the project. The first focus group was just to explain to them what I've just explained now about some of the background of why we're concerned about self-harm in older people, and just to have a conversation about it, to talk about how could we turn our concerns into a bit of a campaign, raise awareness. You know, we're talking about self-harm, which, you know, is stigmatized enough. How can we reach an older audience? We had the first focus group and the second, a cartoonist. which really helped actually with engagement. So Tom was brilliant. He just did some cartoons throughout the focus group, capturing people's thoughts and the issues that they felt, you know, existed, and maybe solutions for them. And then at the end of the session, he shared these cartoons that he'd produced for everybody to see, and they were great conversation pieces. So instead of having a whole A4 kind of, you know, lots of wordy discussions about self-harm and older people, it was just a cartoon which seemed to sum up some of the issues, and it really got people talking and quite creative. We have had the working group, and you know, some of the points that were raised in the first focus group was we needed to kind of have a positive focus, if that was possible, when we're talking about this quite heavy issue. We want to represent older people in a positive way. So when we're talking about the imagery and things, you know, they were saying we don't want to see an elderly person sat in an armchair in their slippers. You know, we need to change the kind of the aging perceptions. And we need to think about accessibility, that not everybody is online. You know, there are lots of older people who are definitely more IT savvy than I am. But there's those that aren't, and so having posters that they see, you know, when they go to the local library or to the GP surgery, you know, we need to be thinking along those lines. So the second focus group, we came back to them with the cartoon images that Tom had developed, ones that we thought kind of told the story we wanted, maybe the best. The design company, or the creator that I have sometimes worked with, had also come up with 2 alternative designs, which were really quite modern. And we presented these 3 designs, and the entire focus group all preferred the cartoon version. They, you know, they really liked that one. So that was quite an easy focus group, because we all agreed on what the imagery we wanted going forward, and also the wording and the messages. And what's been great is we have older people groups who are going to be helping to distribute posters into their community spaces, so they will know the best places to go. So next slide, please. So this is what Jill shares, and when Jill speaks, actually, it's been really nice, because she said how she so much enjoys being part of this process and feels like older people's voice has been very much heard. But, you know, the benefits, we talked about co-production earlier on, talking about safety plans. But, you know, it's a way of raising awareness in itself. You know, we were actually engaging with those people we would want to engage with, and, you know, they were giving us advice about that. We know the campaign is going to appeal and be relatable. We hope that's true, because, you know, the campaign has been put together by older people themselves. There's a sense of ownership that people have felt, and as I said, they're going to help with the distribution and sharing the messages. Next slide, please. So this is the poster that they were happy with, where it was on that we sometimes have sayings that we're familiar with, you know, don't brush things under the carpet, or sweep things under the carpet, some people would say. And it was felt that this might be a lighter way of approaching a difficult subject. And I don't know how clearly you can see it, but we've got a number of words that are being brushed under the carpet, and self-harm is one. And we did talk about whether self-harm was the best terminology, but in the end we felt it was probably the most succinct. But we talk about, you know, someone being anxious or sad or lonely or grieving or depressed. We are encouraging people to talk to someone they trust, whether that's a loved one, a neighbour, or a health professional. And we are, if people want to follow the link, it takes them through to our Shining a Light on Suicide website, where we are designing an older person, a page that will be more relevant to older people. So, you know, I'm keen to find out about any organisations maybe that specifically offer support to older people that we can direct them to. But our whole campaign, for people that may be struggling, we always direct to Samaritans, knowing that it's quite a trusted 24/7 support service. And something else that they wanted was a QR code. So for those that are a bit more kind of IT savvy, they wanted the QR code that would take them directly to the page on the website. But we also thought of family and friends who may see it and want to capture that and then share it, or it might prompt their conversation with their elderly loved ones. Next page, please. So we will be doing it. We didn't have lots of money for the campaign, so it's a fairly small campaign. We've got the main poster, and then we're going to put out some of the social media assets. And obviously the wording that will accompany them will be, you can mention self-harm. But we wanted to encourage people to talk and to listen. So again, a phrase, a problem shared is a problem halved. You know, it's something that people are familiar with. Next slide, please. We have presented at a couple of groups, and last week we actually spoke at the Faculty of the Psychology of Older People, part of the British Psychological Society, and we shared there. We're really conscious that though we are encouraging older people to seek some support if they feel they need it, we need to make sure that the professionals or people they speak to are more open to making sure that support is offered. We don't, you know, we hear about the statistics where, you know, only 12% of people, older people, are referred through. We need to change that. So we used our presentation opportunity to run another focus group, to be honest, but hearing from professionals what they felt the barriers were. And it was great to get the responses back and some of the ideas. And there was real interest of how other areas could kind of maybe raise awareness of older people and self-harm and kind of change some of the cultural thinking within professionals themselves. And the next slide, please. Oh yeah, we can jump that one. References. Oh, and that's me. So as I mentioned, our launch, it's a soft launch on the 1st of March. It's just the start of a conversation. We have an amazing online news, I'll say news platform called Talking About My Generation that works in Greater Manchester, and it's a social enterprise where people aged 50 and over. It's a website all about things that people over 50 want to share. They also train up community reporters. And I know when we launched our Speak Their Name suicide bereavement quilt in Greater Manchester the year before last, they came and interviewed those involved and did a really brilliant article. But that's Talking About My Generation kind of news feed reaches quite a lot of our population. So they are going to be helping us to raise awareness, and they're writing an article as well that will go in there, and they're going to be sharing those kind of assets, communication assets. So yes, we're quite excited, but like I said, it is the beginning of a conversation, but we just felt this is a subject that really needs addressing. You know, we have a Greater Manchester bereavement service, so we are trying to encourage those that are struggling with bereavement, you know, to access support. Also long-term pain conditions. You know, we are looking at those individual factors and how we can influence things for the better. But we just thought it was worth doing a campaign to try and bring more attention to older people and self-harm. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Adele, and thanks for taking the time as well to set the scene with the impromptu cameo from Nav.
Yes, I have to say thank you very much to Nav for co-delivering there. Yeah.
Yeah, but great as well to hear about that right at the start. You know, with you launching next week, and it'll be great to maybe hear an update in the future and be joined by Jill and colleagues. And thank you. I know you filled in quite a last minute slot on our agenda, so I'd like to thank you for stepping in and sharing that with us, today. And as you mentioned there, if anyone's aware of any support for older people, any services, then please do put them in the chat, and Adele can refer to those. But we've got